Hey everybody, I hope you're well here in week 2 of our course on persuasion. Today's task, this video's task, is pretty monumental. I've got to figure out how to transition for 2,500 years, give or take, which is that the first week of the course we were interested in humanity's ancient interest in the study of what moves us, what motivates us, what influences us, what persuades us. We focused exclusively on one subsection of the ancient Greek rhetoricians, what many people call the sophists or students of Plato, especially Aristotelian theories of rhetoric, which is just to say that that is the oldest written form of the human interest in persuasion that we have in a kind of a systematic way. Aristotelian ideas and sophistic ideas, which you'll remember from your reading, lasted for 2,000 years, and present day scholars such as myself still use Aristotelian methods, or at least Aristotelian concepts, in the pursuit of studies of rhetoric. But that doesn't say that there's a straight line from there to persuasion research in the 19th and the 20th centuries. In fact, it's a little bit uneven. We can find some evidence that the rhetorical inquiry and the inquiry in becoming more persuasive, rhetoric as a persuasive skill, was taught to generations and generations of people. So, to give a few examples, Cleopatra was trained in the rhetorical studies. Fast forward many hundreds of years, Shakespeare was trained in rhetorical studies. And what they were trained in was often called the progymnasmata. The progymnasmata is a series of between 15 and 20 specific exercises, like you need to get better at capturing an audience's attention. So you get a hypothetical scenario and you write 10 different possible attention getters down. You need to become better at argumentation. And so you're supposed to argue as your opponent and then argue against yourself when presenting a case so you can flip both sides and become a better debater. Those are the kinds of things that Cleopatra and even Shakespeare were interested in doing. And along those times, we have many more theorists of rhetoric, like Vico, who's a very famous Italian rhetorical theorist. St. Augustine, when he was not writing Christian treatises, was writing quite a bit on rhetoric. And of course, the Enlightenment is populated by many people, Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes especially, who are quite interested in rhetoric's role in a democratic society or whatever form of government would take place after a monarchy. But that said, there are a few unique events at the end of the 1900s and the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s that we need to concentrate on as we set up the rest of the course, which is really about 20th century social scientific theories of persuasion and influence that come largely out of the communication field, which is in its infancy at the beginning of the 20th century. Roughly around World War I is when communication sort of splits or secedes off from what was then English, even though communication, as we've learned last week, was 2,000 years old or so, and Aristotle and Plato were writing in 500 BCE. As a proper organized discipline in the U.S. Academy, it really doesn't get its start until around World War I or so. So there are a few events at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, that really give rise to the study of persuasion. And we're going to talk today about types of theories of persuasion that emerged in the 20th century. And then the rest of the course, we'll talk about very specific instances of those theories in action. So the first event that we need to talk about is the role of mass communication. The rise of mass communication technology, the ability to reach not just hundreds of people with your voice or with an amplified voice, but massive radio stations that could reach states, multiple zip codes, hundreds, even thousands of square miles, introduce brand new opportunities for mass advertising, as well as mass influence, including fears about demagogues taking control of radio stations, politicians using radio stations for ill-gotten gains. Around the same time, which is the early 1900s, we have the rise of public relations, which extends, weirdly enough, from the rise of modern psychology. So Freud, William James, Carl Jung are enterprising in psychological treatises at the same time. But weirdly enough, one of Freud's understudies, who was actually his nephew, a guy by the name of Edward Bernays. Bernays is really principally one of the key fathers of modern public relations research, which is really just taking Freudian concepts about what motivates people, what is in people's base psyche, how to appeal to people's ego in advertising, and then trying to make a lot of money with that using the engines of mass technology and mass motivation on behalf of corporate and even personal interests. So at the same time, we have the rise of modern psychology, we have the rise of modern mass communication, and we have, around the same decades, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, the rise of public relations. And then the final instance is World War I and World War II, and not necessarily the combat itself or the warfighting capabilities of this nation and other nations, but the important role of propaganda in both. And so after World War I, we see in the form of an early communication theorist who was more of a public writer than he was a professor, but his name was Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was very concerned that people were easily influenced by stereotypes, easily influenced by pathos-based emotional arguments, easily influenced by fear appeals, as it were. And he wrote a series of books called Propaganda and Public Opinion, and many others, warning about the threat to democracy from these kinds of mass persuasion. From his work and many others' work, a series of people in the academy, folks like myself, scholars of communication, begin organizing themselves around creating theories about what moves people and doesn't move people in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then after the end of World War II, the US government got involved and actually started really funding mass communication research, social scientific research. And this was to win hearts and minds during the Cold War, as well as to prevent another world war. So the role of propaganda and the role of violence in World War I and World War II really accelerates these trends. So as communication is breaking away from English around World War I, and then of course the violence that ensued in World War I and World War II, what we have is a massive investment by the federal government and a massive public interest in communication technology, and of course in the form of public relations, a massive private interest in commodifying the kinds of techniques that the ancient Greeks were so interested in. So that is the kind of situation, that is the kind of context in which all of the theories we're about to discuss take place. That's the transition from 500 BC to roughly 1920 through 1950, which is where we're going to reside today.